I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Nicole Cabrera, to the Real Mental podcast.
Hi, Marcia. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. And I'm very excited to have you on today to talk about the movie The Penguin Lessons, because I think we'll have a fun discussion.
I think so too. Yeah. I had the pleasure at seeing this early. I saw this last year at the film festival, and it's been a movie I haven't really been able to shake since, to be quite honest with you.
Great. Well, before we talk about the movie, why don't you talk a little bit about who you are and what you do for the listener?
Sure. So my name's Nicole Cabrera. I'm a lifetime film fan and a recent reviewer. So I started writing reviews on Films Fatale, which is a website my friend Andreas is the creator and co-founder of. And I have started to write reviews there. And on my spare time, when I'm not watching and reviewing movies, I teach. And I also work at the TIFF Bell Light Bots. So I'm kind of surrounded in and around films year round, but films have always been a part of my life. And I'm hoping to make them a more prominent part of my life. And yeah.
That's great. Yeah, I wanted to see that film at TIFF, and because I was there on a press pass and there were like so many movies to see, I couldn't fit it into my schedule and I was so annoyed. So when I saw it coming out and I was able to get a screener, I jumped on it. I was like, yeah, I really want to see this movie because I mean penguins, right?
Exactly.
So so why don't you share with the listeners what your impressions were? And you said it was staying with you, this film, and so I'm really interested to know why.
Yeah, so this movie is really interesting for several aspects. On a technical aspect, it's really interesting because it is a movie that actually uses real life animals. And in this sort of day and age, that's kind of an oddity. They're usually more CGI created. So it was really nice to kind of hear the director was at our screening and he talked about like working with actual animal actors, which was really interesting. And on an emotional level, movies that kind of blend human and animal journeys are kind of far and few between these days. And not only was this a movie that kind of got to the heart of a lot of human emotions about grief and loss, but it also was a movie about kind of growing and kind of changing and becoming a different person over time. And these are movies that I feel like are kind of vitally important that we've kind of lost a little bit. So it was refreshing to kind of see a movie, much like the ones that I kind of grew up with in this time and place, and also its historical significance. I'm from a Latin American background, so it was really fascinating to see a movie that also had a cultural look at historical events that happened in Latin America and kind of shed a light on that because that's not often talked about in cinema. So there was a lot of sort of blending of different genres and emotions, and it made the movie feel very poignant and raw and kind of in the moment for me. And like I said, it's been a couple months since I've seen it, but it's still something that's kind of stuck with me.
Cool. I totally agree with you in that, it was about grief and loss and becoming a better person. And that's why I really loved it because as a psychiatrist, I'm always interested in the ways that people deal with grief, deal with loss, and the ways that people can change and what provokes change, right? And
Absolutely.
often, when we are doing a good thing, we're not necessarily doing a good thing because we go, okay, I'm going to go do a good thing. It kind of falls on our in our lap, or we do it for the wrong reasons. Like in this case, he rescued the penguin to impress a woman, but but he still rescued the penguin nevertheless.
Yeah.
And reluctantly, because he was so broken himself, he took care of this animal until the animal, helped him heal. And it's wonderful because he's such a jerk at the beginning of the film, the protagonist. He's so shut down. He's so cynical. He's so disaffected. He's so disengaged. He's just kind of
Mhm.
going through the motions. and you kind of don't like him and you kind of, feel like he's not very sympathetic character. And then this penguin helps him really transform. What did you think about the transformation? Did it feel like cinematically believable to you?
I mean, I think it to an extent, like Hollywood will never be able to get that perfectly spot on because grief is not linear. It's something that you kind of heal from, and then you can relapse back on. So that aspect, obviously, it's not like I healed with it and now life is perfect. But the aspect of having someone to connect with, whether it be another person or an animal, I think was really powerful. And I think what's really interesting, especially when your co star or your person is not human, is that humans sometimes I find are able to speak and relax more so around inanimate objects because they won't be judged. So there is that aspect that, like you said, he's very kind of shut down as a person when we meet him at the beginning of the film. But this little penguin helps him kind of be like, hey, I am a person. I do feel things. And it's okay to kind of open up. And he might not be able to do that with people, at least at the beginning of the film. But with this penguin, he's able to say how he feels little by little because that penguin won't judge him back in that aspect. And I think that's kind of an important bond that's realistic to how people have animals. Like people sometimes say that, animals are better than humans because they won't judge you or they won't leave you. But in the aspect that they can bring us together and they can be something that kind of heals parts of us that we didn't even know needed healing, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah. So what I found is that, I love that piece where all the characters in the film were going to his apartment and they were spending time alone with the penguin and kind of using the penguin as their confessor and telling the penguin all their secrets and all their hurts and all their woes. And he was like a therapist, this penguin, because he just
Absolutely.
sat there without judgment, with compassion and with sensitivity and empathy. And these people were unburdening themselves and healing by just sitting there and talking to this little penguin. And, you know, I really feel like what you're talking about in terms of the role of animals in our lives and how animals have, it's not just that they don't judge, but they have other kinds of qualities. They don't have language, but they have tremendous sensitivity, tremendous empathy, and intuition. Like I have a friend who has a medical condition, and every time she's about to get sick, her service animal comes up to her, right? And I
Mhm.
have a patient who was also going through some medical issues, and her cat would come up to her when there was an issue. So these animals have such intuition about our health. And, we've
Absolutely.
heard so many stories about animals who can just tell if somebody is unwell, or they can comfort you when you're grieving or when you're hurting. So animals have an intuition that's beyond what humans have. And so they can do something for us that maybe even more than what a human can do when we're in this tremendously vulnerable and hurting state.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think it's that aspect of they give you that freedom to be yourself that sometimes we feel like we can't have with other people, even people that are close to us. So it is that sort of ability to open up and kind of speak everything that's in your heart or on your mind. And like you said, that animal has kindness and empathy. And it's often said that, animals naturally flock to people that are kind or good of heart, and they don't approach, people that might be a little more aggressive or a little on the meaner side, for lack of a better word. So the fact that an animal trusts someone, there is already a connection created, and that's sort of like a give and take with another creature.
Yeah, and I really love the fact that, at the beginning, he is this really shut down guy, and it's like he's decided he's done with life, he doesn't care anymore, and he's just, going through the motions until whenever, and his life is very meaningless. And having a creature that's vulnerable starts to give his life meaning, and then of course, he starts to see the others around him who might be vulnerable, the children who he's teaching, the granddaughter of his housekeeper, who's also in a vulnerable position. And he actually helps not just the penguin, but he helps his students to excel and to get along better with each other and to stop bullying each other. And he helps his housekeeper and her granddaughter. And he's becoming a person who cares not just about this little penguin, but the penguin helps him open his heart and care about everyone. And I thought that was a wonderful depiction of really his heart breaking open.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, especially for example, like with his housekeeper's daughter, like when they go to the city together, and you can kind of see that backdrop of the war and sort of the corrupt government that's happening at the time. And you can see when he sees people being unfairly arrested, he's afraid to speak out, he's afraid to sort of step up. And as the movie progresses, it's like his morals that have been asleep kind of reawaken. And the more that he's exposed to this penguin and people around him and kind of seeing how their lives are changing or how their lives are affected, he also kind of refines what it is to be human. And like you said, it feels like, he's very shut down and he's very despondent about his own life. But as the film progresses, he sees that, the people around him also might be struggling, might be having their own battles, and that for good or bad, he's with people, and if he can help people, he should. So, and we kind of see that as he, like you said, he grows to help those students in his class. There's that student that's being bullied by the others, and he kind of bonds them together with the penguin, but it is sort of creating those pockets of community around him.
Yeah, and the thing I like so much about it is that he's helping these people, but they're also, returning the kindness and the caring to him. He's making friends with his colleagues. He's having the students appreciate and respect him, and he's getting back something that he hasn't had in a long time, which is that people like him and people respond to him and people want to be with him and people appreciate him and people value him. So the lesson here, I think, is that when you are loving and kind, people respond to you and you get something back as well. It's not just that he's giving, he's also receiving. So he's receiving from the penguin because, just the pleasure of being with this little creature. And he's receiving from the people because they are happy to be around him and they want to be friends with him, or they admire him and respect him, in terms of his students. So that's a wonderful lesson too, because here we are hearing certain politicians talking about how, we have too much empathy. And my position always is that we always need more empathy. And in this movie, the character has no empathy at the beginning. And then as his empathy grows, he's much happier and people like him more and he has a better quality of life. So to me, empathy is the gift that, is good for the giver and the receiver.
Yeah, and like especially for example, like I believe it's Gustav, who's the other teacher at the
Yes.
school, and you know that some people naturally sort of have that gift because he automatically approaches him with kindness. He wants to be his friend. He wants to get to know him, and he keeps getting brushed off at the beginning. And as the film develops, and he meets the penguin, and they create those connections, and he shows him that kindness, like you said, is not an enemy. It's something that we all benefit from and we all grow from together. And I completely agree. Like in especially in kind of the way the world is right now, we need more people creating empathy for others and understanding people wherever we can get it. I think, something as small as smiling at people or saying hi to people or telling them to have a good day, they all seem like nothing actions. But I'm a firm believer that that can still be a make or break in somebody's day.
And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast has created more than 175 episodes over the past several years. Why not have a listen to it today? Absolutely, absolutely. In my other podcast, Ruthless Compassion, I interviewed a lot of people who write and talk about empathy, and we talked about how, one day somebody was dealing with a counter person who was really in a bad mood, and they had a choice. They could, meet them with frustration, or they could say, "Wow, it looks like you're having a really hard time." And the counter person stopped and went, yeah, it's been really bad. My colleague didn't call in. I've been on my feet for the last 15 hours without a break. I haven't had my lunch. I'm exhausted. People are yelling at me because I'm going slowly because I'm the only one here. And it's just been so hard. And and then the person said back to them, I'm really sorry that you're going through that. Take care of yourself. And the person just lit up. This person who was so sour and so miserable lit up. Just that little bit of kindness transformed them, and they were able to finish their shift in a much better place because a human being saw them and recognized them and took a second to just say, I'm a human, you're a human. I'm sorry you're going through this. And you're not a bad person because you're in a bad mood. You're struggling. And to see that, a person who's struggling can look like they're in a bad mood, like he did at the beginning, but maybe all they need is some human empathy and compassion, and then they will transform.
Yeah, and especially with him because he had gone through such a big personal loss, something that, nobody would want to experience. I- It's very hard to relate to people on that level. So he feels isolated, and he's obviously built up these walls around himself, assuming that because people haven't experienced the same thing as him, that they'll never understand how he feels. And it is sort of that vicious human cycle. When we have no way to reach out to others, we get trapped in our own pain, and then it can drag on for months, years. And that's how we kind of find them in the movie, because people sometimes don't know how to reach out with empathy too. I feel like it's hard to make that step in order to be like, I want to be able to help you in your pain, because it's hard to talk about pain oftentimes. Or you don't, if you know that person is suffering, you don't want to bring it up again. And that's a struggle, I think, that's very human, but again, shows that we care about one another. If you're thinking about hurting other people's feelings, it means that you care about them.
Yeah, well, I think often the indirect approach is a really excellent approach when we're dealing with someone who's really struggling with a lot of pain and grief and loss. And you can do the indirect approach by having activities that you two do together. Yeah, just doing things together that aren't directly about the pain, or having, this animal who's something to focus on. So if you're focusing on something outside of yourself that's not your pain, whether it's your pet or your animal that you're caring for or an activity that you're doing, you can create a connection and an empathy between you without having to focus this big flashlight onto the pain, which might be overwhelming at first. And then eventually, maybe you can, talk a little bit more about the feelings. But having that indirect approach is a very, I think, safe and comfortable approach when someone is dealing with a lot of loss. So this penguin acted like that intermediate object so that everyone could focus on the penguin and create connections amongst themselves through that penguin. So he was like the hub, and all the people were the spokes in the wheel. And they created this wheel with everyone focusing on the penguin. So the kids, like you say, he used the penguin to make sure that the kids all connected and all the staff members connected with each other. So everyone used that penguin as like the center point and focused on him and created this beautiful connection amongst themselves without having to like become overwhelmed by all the emotions, especially back what it's the 70s. People weren't talking about their feelings so much, especially not in a a high class prep school in Argentina. It wasn't the thing to do. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like I said, I think one of the other sort of drawing points about the movie is the setting of Argentina itself. So the film takes place in the 70s in a time period in Argentina known as the Dirty War. So it's an anti-communist war that was happening. And my parents are from Ecuador, so we didn't go through the same sort of issue. But as a child, I remember growing up and hearing stories about like a quote unquote sort of secret police that would come away and take people in the night when they spoke out against the government. And there is that sort of aspect in this time period in Argentina that people who are speaking out or freedom fighting are being taken away. And we see that with one of the characters. And what I appreciate about this film is that the director didn't shy away from that aspect of the history of Argentina. And because Hollywood often sort of falls into stereotypes about countries outside of America, especially if it's, for example, Mexico, they do the cliche of a drug trade. Appreciated that not only did he touch on something that was a true historical event, but he also showed how it affected the community of the people there. So it shows sort of that fear and that insecurity, and that also changes the mentality and the way that people live in that time period. And the director, I believe his name is Peter Cataneo, he spoke at our screening. He talked about people that had gone missing in that time period that still had not been found. And I think that's a difficult but important topic to touch on. It's really easy to brush issues like that under the rug. So I respected him being able to be honest about that happening in the country, because that could have easily been glossed over in pursuit of talking about, how cute the penguin is. But I thought that was a really interesting sort of background to this film.
Yes, and I think it also, like you said, as he grew as a person and his morality woke up again, he was able to step up and do the right thing when it was needed in terms of some of these repressive measures that were taking against people that he knew. So he was able to do something positive, which he would not have done before. He would have said, I'm not getting involved, I can't do anything, whatever. But this time he was brave and he actually took personal risks and got himself into trouble for it. But he really had moral courage. And I think that that's another lesson. It's that when you have empathy, you also develop moral courage and you can stand up to the bullies. And these days, especially, we need to be able to stand up to the bullies. And so, of course, the bullies are going to say, don't have empathy, because when we have more empathy, it makes us stand up to them. So they don't want us to have empathy because they don't want us to stand up to them. So we need to all really take a lesson from this film and have more empathy so that we can have moral courage and we can stand up to people who are trying to do bad things.
100%. And I think it's also so important to see the class division as well, because he comes to this position and he comes from a middle class to upper middle class standing. It's fascinating to see because there's a scene where they give him his first paycheck and he goes into the city and they tell him he has to spend a certain amount of money on certain objects under this governmental regime. And he kind of sees how the people around him are treated. So he's living really well. He has a place to stay. He can buy fancy clothes. He can buy, gifts for some of the housekeepers at the school. But for those other people, they're living dollar to dollar or penny to penny. And it is that sort of struggle. So, tying back to that empathy, him being able to put himself in the shoes of another person, I think is super important in this film. And I think Steve Coogan really showed his acting chops in this film. He was phenomenal because, he's known as sort of that dry wit, charming but sarcastic character, but he was so emotional in this film, and it was so honest and raw. It really did truly move me. So I thought he brought a lot of heart to the film.
I totally agree. And, going back to what you said at the beginning, like there's so much in this film. There really is. It's not just a cute story about a guy and a bird. It's really got so much depth. And if we want to see it, we can really appreciate and enjoy it.
Yeah, I think that it is very multi-layered. It shows that ability of how complex humans are and the many lives that we kind of live and how living shapes us as people. And, there's humor and there's heart to it. I got a lot of, kicks out of sort of before he met the penguin. like, as you brought up before, his initial action with the penguin wasn't being that good Samaritan. He was doing it to kind of, woo over a woman he had met at a nightclub. But the fact is that his sort of silly actions led to this very heartful and very loving action overall. So it is also that sort of human nature aspect that we change and we can change radically and, positively very quickly. So he kind of almost becomes this man that, goes up from being completely shut off to having to be a caretaker very quickly.
Yeah, and so many positive things came from it. Well, listen, I really enjoyed talking to you about this movie today. It's nice to see that in a seemingly simple film, there, like you say, there can be so many layers and so much depth. So, thank you for coming on the Real Mental podcast today. It's really been a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting. If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening.